Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll be sharing my time with the member from Surrey Centre. I rise today, Mr. Speaker, with some humility. I rise to speak not on behalf of a particular political party, because I firmly believe this issue cannot be partisan today. I rise not as a representative of a particular community, because I don't think this is a regional issue that we're discussing today. I rise today, Mr. Speaker, in all sincerity, as a member of Parliament, as a member of this chamber, the House of Commons, committed to serving the public, to serving all Canadians in an effort, a genuine effort, to do what is best for our country. At this stage, I firmly believe that the only way to resolve the present threat that is facing this country is to declare a public order emergency under the Emergencies Act. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by talking about the Charter. Let me state at the outset that the right to freedom of expression is sacrosanct in this country. It's entrenched in Section 2B of the Charter for a reason, because it is the hallmark of our democracy, indeed of any democracy, is the ability for citizens to voice their discontent, to challenge authority, and to seek change. I don't deny any of this. To the contrary, I vigorously defend it, Mr. Speaker. I also don't deny that the people gathered outside this very chamber right now, who have been on the streets of Ottawa for it is now 21 days, have legitimate grievances. Criticisms of my government, of my party, perhaps even of me personally, which they have every right to air. But, Mr. Speaker, in our democracy, freedom of expression, while sacrosanct, is not absolute. This charter protection under Section 2B extends towards lawful, peaceful protest. The charter does not protect illegal, violent blockades. And it is the latter, unfortunately, what this protest has devolved into. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to reference Ottawa. How do I substantiate this assertion I've just made? I substantiate it with the evidence I've gathered with my own eyes and from the accounts of other parliamentarians that have been shared with me. Far from seeing people exercising their constitutional rights to disagree vigorously with the government, we have seen instead intimidation, threats, and harassment. We've seen deliberate nuisances being created by truck horn blowing at all hours of the day and night, rendering the city effectively uninhabitable for local residents. We've seen open displays of hatred, such as swastikas and Confederate flags, and acts of direct hatred where windows are smashed on coffee shops that dare to fly the pride flag. We've seen the desecration of national monuments, including our National War Memorial. We've seen deliberate efforts to block the movement of people and goods by people intentionally disabling large vehicles and trucks by things like activating their air brakes or actually removing the tires from their vehicle. We've seen death threats then follow towards an Ottawa tow trucking company accused of being complicit with police efforts to remove such disabled vehicles. We've seen the shuttering of businesses in the entire downtown core, impeding residents' ability to work, which parenthetically I would say is puzzling, Mr. Speaker, to say the least, from protesters who claim to eschew lockdowns, having themselves caused Ottawa's downtown to enter into a lockdown for a period of now 3 weeks. We've seen intimidation and threats of the media. Again, ironic for those who would be more ardent defenders of freedom of expression than even me in terms of what I've already articulated. We've seen the active sabotage of 911 emergency call lines and even an attempted arson, Mr. Speaker. The protest, which ostensibly started out about vaccine mandates, has morphed into what resembles an occupation of the city by people who have openly declared, Mr. Speaker, on the public record that they are seeking to overthrow the government. That constitutes a complete breakdown of public order in Ottawa. And despite efforts from the Ottawa Police Services, Mr. Speaker, law and order in the nation's capital has been impossible to maintain. But the evidence that I'm outlining here, Mr. Speaker, extends beyond the nation's capital. You've heard reference to the borders, and I want to address this now. What commenced as a protest targeting this city and this parliament has emerged as a concerted effort to block our national border crossings and impede the flow of people and goods. Foreign entities openly and publicly in Texas and Florida and other parts of the United States and indeed other nations have openly declared their sympathy with the blockades and admitted to sending money and resources to help the blockades continue. Today, the Anti-Defamation League showed a result of their analysis of the Give, Send, Go website and found 1,100 people in the United States who supported the January 6th insurrection of last year actually donated money under Give, Send, Go to these blockades, Mr. Speaker. Just let that settle in for a moment in terms of what the motivations are for such types of people. The blockades that have emerged around the country are deliberately targeting critical infrastructure. We know about what's happened at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Detroit. That multi-day siege, Mr. Speaker, and now I'm wearing my hat as a Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade, on Canada's busiest border crossing alone resulted in the suspension of nearly $400 million in daily trade between Canada and the United States, the cancellation of shifts at multiple auto plants in southern Ontario, and an intervention by President Biden and the Governor of Michigan showing that confidence in Canada as a safe place to invest, do business, and trade with is starting to erode. Blockades have occurred in Surrey, in Emerson, at Coutts, Alberta. And what should be startlingly alarming for every person in this chamber and for every Canadian watching right now is that when the RCMP went to clear the Coutts border crossing, they made 13 arrests, including laying charges for conspiracy to commit murder. Wow. Now, I'm going to say that again, Mr. Speaker. Conspiracy to commit murder. And they found firearms, ammunition, and body armor, Mr. Speaker. Wow. That bore out certainly my worst fears, but I think all of our worst fears, Mr. Speaker, that blockade protesters were armed and preparing for violent confrontation with law enforcement. Mr. Speaker, the violence is continuing to ratchet up. We've had bomb threats at a Vancouver hospital, suspicious packages and language about hanging members of Parliament being sent to colleagues of mine from Nova Scotia. Why am I laying this all out, Mr. Speaker, in such excruciating detail? I'm laying it out because there's a legal test that must be met when you're doing something that has not been done ever under this legislation, or even in this country under antecedent legislation in 52 years. The test is high, as it should be, when you're considering a statute which permits temporarily for the suspension of civil liberties. What is that test, Mr. Speaker? The test is entrenched in Section 3 of the Emergencies Act. It says a national emergency is an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or one that seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. Mr. Speaker, it is my fundamental belief that this high legal threshold has been met in this case. When you have a blockade laying siege to an entire city for 21 days and counting, intimidating, harassing, and threatening locals, rendering a city uninhabitable, you're endangering the safety of Canadians. When those blockades limit the ability of medical first responders to respond quickly to emergencies, you're endangering the lives of those on the other ends of those 911 calls. When factions armed with weapons and ammunition are blockading borders, you're directly endangering the lives of Canadians. When groups are deliberately blocking trade corridors with our single largest trading partner, grinding our border traffic to a halt, you're threatening the ability of the federal government to preserve our sovereignty and our economic security. Mr. Speaker, these are important. In the last 2 minutes, what I want to do is address some of the general objections we've been hearing, not just today, but prior to this. To those who say there's an overreach here, I say 5 things, 5 checks that are important. 1, everything done by a government under the Emergencies Act must be done in accordance with the Charter. That's entrenched in the preamble. All declarations are time limited, 30 days, no more. In fact, it may be less, and hopefully it will be less in this context. Third, the very act of declaring an emergency under the declaration must be reviewed by a committee of all members of Parliament and senators from all parties. Fourth, the exercise of powers under the declaration must be reviewed by that committee. And fifth, following the end of an emergency, a full inquiry must be held. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is not a power grab. It is not the invocation of the War Measures Act. We are simply giving the RCMP the power to enforce local laws and work quickly with local law enforcement. We are not calling in the armed forces. We are not putting the RCMP or any other police force under the control of the government. Policing operational decisions remain independent, as they must in any democracy. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to end with the right to protest, because people have said, what about my children's right to protest? And I take this very seriously, because I myself have taken children of mine to protest. This law talks about the right of lawful protest. It is entrenched in black and white. The measures that we are contemplating are measures that would address or prohibit public assembly that is a threat to leading to a breach of the peace. We are specifically carving out the right of lawful advocacy, protest, and dissent. And Mr. Speaker, for those that say that the threats have been addressed, what I say to you is that Windsor had an attempted blockade yesterday, and that we know that protesters are returning to the Quebec National Assembly on the 19th. I'm going to conclude with a sincere undertaking to the members of this chamber and to all Canadians that I will do everything in my power to ensure that this act lasts for only as long as is absolutely necessary. I will do everything in my power to ensure that there is no overbreath and then to ensure that charter rights are always fundamentally protected. All members of Parliament should strive for nothing less. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.